KPBS On Demand is supported by Splatero, helping homeowners pay off debt or for home improvements by offering streamlined access to your home's equity with no additional monthly payments or new debt. Splatero provides a lump sum payment in exchange for a share of your home's future value. Learn more at splatero.com.
Welcome back to another episode of listener-supported KPBS Cinema Junkie podcast. I'm Beth Accomando. Jordan Peele's Us has been killing it at the box office, and it's been stirring a lot of discussion about what it all means. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But to get us started, here's the trailer.
You know how sometimes things line up? Coincidences? Since we've been up here, they've been happening more and more. It's like there's this black cloud hanging over us.
There's a family in our driveway.
Who is that?
Run.
What are you people?
It's us.
Us serves up a very different kind of horror from Peele's debut feature, Get Out, but it's scary good in its own way. So today, I'm going to try and peel back some layers of Us with UC Riverside professor John Jennings. But fair warning, there's spoilers ahead. That's right, you've had more than a week to get to a theater to check out this eagerly anticipated film. And because it's nearly impossible to talk about without revealing something that should be kept secret, I'm doing this podcast just for those of us who've seen the film and are dying to discuss what it all means with somebody else. Peele had his cast members watch 10 films in preparation for making Us. Dead Again, The Shining, The Babadook, It Follows, A Tale of Two Sisters, The Birds, Funny Games, Martyrs, Let the Right One In, and The Sixth Sense. And just to lay a little more groundwork for the discussion I'm going to have with John Jennings, here's an interview with Jordan Peele from the Universal Studios press kit for Us.
I tend to draw inspiration from my own fear. I at some point I asked myself, what's the scariest thing for me personally? And in this case, it was the idea of seeing myself. Then I think about what that's about. Why is seeing yourself so scary? I think no one really wants to look at their faults, their guilt, their demons. We all want to look elsewhere. This country and how this country looks at the world we have a fear of the outsider, a fear of everything from terrorism to immigration, the very thing this country is founded on. And the thing that we do not face often enough is our part in what's wrong with the world.
John, I had you on my podcast recently talking about your collective called Scary Black Folks, and we discussed a little bit about Jordan Peele's Get Out and his upcoming film Us, but now Us has hit theaters. People have had a week to see it, and there's so many layers to it that I wanted to come back to you so that we could talk about it spoiler rich and kind of try to peel back a few of these layers. So just to start off, kind of what was your kind of gut reaction to it? What's your kind of capsule review?
Oh, after I'd seen it, I saw it like the Thursday. I saw it on the release date. I had this really kind of visceral reaction to it. Yeah, I think once the reveal of the switch, so to speak, happened, that was the thing that really just kind of took my legs out. You know, I didn't really see it coming. I think I kind of thought about it for a second because there's some clues. If you go back through it, there are, I think, clues about like things being off kilter with Red and Adelaide. But yeah, I think the horrific thing for me is, number one, you took away our protagonist, because now you're like, whoa, what does that mean? Like, she's a bad person, or is she bad? You know, so that's the thing. It's like there really isn't a clear-cut person to root for. And I think that's why people have had such strong reactions to that. It's like the protagonist is taken from you and then switched up on you. And then automatically you're supposed to feel for the person who has been the antagonist, who's trying to get her life back to a certain degree. And so that was actually a really interesting kind of psychological play. And I just instantly felt horrible for Adelaide being chained to that bed as a little girl. That also kind of indicates that perhaps the shadows, the tethers, actually discovered that they can actually control their counterparts up top, which I thought was actually a really interesting reveal as well. So overall, I think, like, you know, he's definitely grown as a storyteller and a filmmaker. I mean, he took $20 million and turned it into this kind of extravaganza. It was only a $20 million movie, the way it was put together. Some people have some issues with pacing. I didn't really have many issues with pacing. But I think overall, I was, like, kind of blown away by it. I thought it was definitely a step in this really expansive direction, because he really could have, like, told a more intimate story like he did with Get Out and had it more about this family and actually talk about race and, like, double consciousness theory. That's a really easy, that's a gimme for, like, you know, Du Boisian double consciousness around race. But to actually have this really broader discussion about, you know, class, or the haves and the have-nots, or the inner demons that we kind of, like, struggle with on a day-to-day basis, I mean, that actually, I think, is a far more expansive way to look at what horror is really good at doing. That was my initial thing. So.
I know. See, just an initial reaction, and you've got, like, all these different layers to it.
I was on fire. My head was on fire because I knew that he was going to come with, like, some kind of crazy, like, you know, people forget, you know, or maybe they don't. He's a comedian, too.
Right.
So it's like the punchline, right? The idea of horror and comedy are very, very closely connected. Yeah. And so when you go back through and you look at Key and Peele's comedies, they deal with the uncanny a lot, actually. They deal with these really outlandish notions. They push it. They're always pushing, you know, to these other things. And so even from, you know, it's about the one-upmanship in those particular things. So, like, what is the next level? Like, he kind of leveled up as far as, like, even just the lighting in the film, the choosing of these beautiful, darkly melanated family, and how you light those people beautifully. You know, I'm looking at all the terror. I was like, oh, my God, Lupita looks amazing in this light.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like, that's kind of things I was kind of struggling with. Like, oh, this is a beautiful film, but, oh, that's terrible. Why did that happen? You know, that kind of thing.
Well, it was funny because I was feeling this connection to It Follows, and then I found out that it was the same cinematographer, and I'm going, that makes total sense. Total sense.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, It Follows is a really beautifully shot film, too. Yeah. Another really, really disturbingly open-ended. I think the other thing, too, that people who didn't like Us, because there are people who didn't like it, right? They want the closed ending. They want this kind of westernized notion of, like, oh, you know, we killed the bad guys and it's over with. It's like, no, it's just beginning, actually, and we don't know what's about to happen, and that's the horror of it. So that's part of the terror. Yeah, and so I think it definitely functions as a really well-constructed, very disturbing and beautiful horror film.
For some people, if you go in thinking, like, this is the kickoff to Jordan Peele's Twilight Zone reboot, like, you're better prepared for where it goes, I think, than if you go into it going like, wow, I loved Get Out and I hope he does another film like that.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is, like, we are taught to consume media in a particular way. Like, in this kind of, like, in the sequel-ridden space that Hollywood is now, we're thinking like, oh, okay, well, I've been waiting forever to see Incredibles 2, right? But you don't really want it to be too different from the first Incredibles movie. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
No, and I'm like, well, no, this is a very different type of film. It's Get Out is a horror movie in a particular way. This is a different type of horror movie. It's more psychological. It's more surreal, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So people are coming in with story logic, like, oh, well, you know, where'd the clones come from? You know, and how, you know, why didn't they cook the rabbits? And, you know, it's all these like, people are trying to wrestle with the story, with the world building. And that's the other thing too, is that we are living in a space where, like, we have these very intricate worlds like Harry Potter and Star Wars and Marvel, and he's not coming at it from this particular standpoint. It really is about the messages and not necessarily about the minutiae of, like, you know, who cares where they came from? You got to deal with them.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? They're here now, and I don't necessarily care about, like, how do they eat rabbits every day? You know what I'm saying? So these are the things that people are coming up with. And I think that some people will say, oh, you know what, this would be even a better series because you get because people want that back matter, you know? Mm-hmm. I don't have any preconceived notions about the story. I say, okay, well, tell me a story. Let's see what happens. And I have a very wide berth when it comes to, like, suspension of disbelief. I'm a huge Doctor Who fan, for God's sake. You can't, you know what I'm saying? So it's like, you have to have, like, a really, serious sense of suspension of disbelief. I'm not trying to figure the movie out either. That's the other thing. Like, some people, like, could come away like, oh, that wasn't what I expected, or, I figured this movie out too soon, or, that's not what I would have done. And so those types of critiques, I'm like, well, you deal with what's on the screen, Mm-hmm. So when I was looking at this, I was like, well, this is a very layered, very interesting conversation about, how otherness is constructed, right? Mm-hmm. And, for people who are saying, like, well, what's up with these clones? Can clones have kids? I was like, well, they never said that they were clones. They call them tethers. They call them shadows, right? And that actually speaks to other more supernatural aspects that are not necessarily connected to cloning, you know what I'm saying? Because how would they get out? Right. So then you start like, well, if it's scientific, then what else? You start thinking about, well, how did these clones get made? And I was like, well, they didn't call themselves clones. They call themselves tethers or shadows.
Shadows.
That's the parlance that they were speaking.
What's interesting to me, too, is that coming out of a preview screening, there were a number of people who were kind of like looking at it kind of strictly as a formula horror film, in the sense if they're going like, oh, well, I figured out the twist halfway through the movie, and it seems like even if I tell somebody what the twist is, I feel like that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of what the film is really about.
Right.
'Cause I feel like the fact that you find out that the little girls were switched at the beginning,
right,
and you don't discover this till the end, is almost as much a kind of a break with trust with your audience as when Alfred Hitchcock killed Janet Leigh in the first 20 minutes. Because you kind of like, you're thinking that this is the person that you're going to be empathizing with and identifying with all the way through till maybe the end. And so what he does here is he makes you empathize with this character, and at the very end you find out she's the one who put the little girl in this underworld,
right,
and made her suffer in her place.
Yes.
And then it's like, do I now switch allegiance?
Yeah.
And
no, and
it's
that person's
difficult.
now dead. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And you also, it's a very complex narrative, and I think, that's exactly what I felt like the rug was pulled off my. I mean, I was like, oh my God, no. Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult narrative, and it's like that's why horror is such a really interesting genre to play around with. And I think that, again, people have forgotten what horror is because of the jump scares and the sequels and the blood and the gore. That's not horror. That's actually those that can be horror, but horror really is the sense of affect that you have after watching something like that. It's the feeling of dread and like unease and ennui that you leave the theater with. So it's like, man, that messed my head up. And I remember the first time I felt that like when I could really like understand what I was seeing was Angel Heart, right? Like when I watched Angel Heart, I was thinking I was like in high school, and me and my friends were like, it totally messed our heads up. We were like, wait, what did we just watch? It's a great ending, and it's a problematic film, but it's like, it reminded me of this, where it's like, whoa, what I don't care about this other stuff. I'm feeling for this little girl now, who is now dead and skewered by and choked out by her doppelganger, right? So that's who enjoyed doing it, So that's the other thing. Like she almost like reveled in the freedom because she had been living with the dread of her finding her. What I'm saying? So I feel like, who do you root for? Yeah, that was really well done, I think.
And then it changes, like if you look backwards, it changes the kind of dread it was, because when you start the film, you think it's the dread of this like unknown, that she doesn't know what this thing is. And then when we get to the end, we realize that the dread was really connected to her facing the reality of who she really was and what she had really done. And it's like a completely different kind of dread.
Yeah, which is totally like symbolically displayed by the slow discoloration of her white clothing. When she has on this white bed, like this pajama set or whatever, and then little by little she becomes colored with basically the color that is her real name, which is red. That's the character's name, Red. And so little by little she becomes the thing that she hates. She starts to become, that shadow person, which I think is actually really well done too. I mean, so many different things around symbolism. Another movie, I thought about Upstairs, Downstairs,
Yeah.
Because this is obviously too about class, as far as like, the have and have not, this kind of weird like mythology around like the mole people, like people living under caverns and stuff like that. Like he sets up a really interesting parable. But honestly, when Adelaide, when she uses the term like once upon a time, it becomes an allegory. To me, it was like it changes the type of story it is. Once she says once upon a time, all bets are off, because then it becomes a fairy tale. It becomes a parable or allegory. And those things they're very much about oral history and about like, subverting this idea of the technical notions of how stories unfold even. That I thought was really interesting too. She was telling us a story and she utilizes the term shadow. So I think about the idea of like, well, what casts a shadow? So I started thinking about stuff like the parable of the cave, I started thinking about Jungian ideas around how shadows are constructed, with the, as far as like how we see ourselves. This obviously is about these really, really complex connections with the other. When I think about race in particular, I think a lot about I always use the allegory of, or the example of Peter Pan chasing his shadow.
Right.
But when you meet Peter Pan with Wendy, he comes in through the window in the cartoon, and he's chasing his shadow. He's trying to reconnect that shadow. He's trying to tether himself back to the thing that defines him, because a lot of times we're defined by the things that we aren't, right? And so this idea of like projecting ourselves into this darker space, who do you root for? These things are part of each other. It reminds me also of that Star Trek episode back in the day when Kirk splits himself.
Yeah.
And so there's one part that's all id, and this other part is kind of like more ego, and they really need each other to survive. It brings up these interesting ideas about like just the idea of like the self. But then, of course, like politically, when you see the Hands Across America thing, you're looking at like, oh, they're colored red, and they almost look like a human border wall. Or is this talking about redlining and sectioning off of space? Are we talking about manifest destiny? Are we talking about nativism? I mean, these different conversations that start to happen when you see how like bodies mark off space, because it's always a connection between like space and identity as well. So, you can look at the relationship between like the Morlocks and the Eloi from like, the first time travel story. So the time machine story. So there's always these different connections that I think that he's kind of playing out that aren't necessarily like the deepest connections, but they're very complex connections. And I think that some people weren't ready to grasp those or to work with those. They want to be entertained and say, okay, who I root for, we kill the monster and we leave, right? And he doesn't give you that. And he gives us, and you come and you leave actually with more questions than you have with answers. And that's frustrating to some people, but I love that about the film, too.
I want to play an interview bite from Jordan Peele that's from the press kit that Universal presents. And here he talks a little bit about how he got into the idea of doppelgangers.
The idea for this movie came from a deep-seated fear in doppelgangers. And I love the doppelganger mythologies and different movies that have dealt with them. And I just desperately wanted to make my offering to that sort of pantheon of evil double films. I think what really made it come together for me, that brought this idea together for me, was this idea that we are our own worst enemy, which is something I feel like we know intrinsically, but it is a truth that we tend to bury. We tend to blame the outsider and blame the other. When in this movie, the monster has our faces.
Jordan Peele talks about how we can be our own worst enemies. And what's complicated and interesting about that is the switch that happens with these little girls raises the idea of, if that switch never happened, would anyone like ever have been aware of kind of these two worlds? Because it seems like the real Adelaide, knowing what the world above is like, then being in the world below, is kind of the catalyst for this rebellion.
That's right.
And again, it brings up multiple kind of interpretations about where your sympathies and empathy should lie.
Yeah, definitely. So I came with this term called, with Stanford Carpenter, called the ethnogothic. I think kind of talked about that a little bit too. One of the tried and true tropes of the Gothic is the doppelganger, the mirror self, the shadow self, and sometimes it's actually physical. and sometimes it's more philosophical. Like a classic example is like Batman and the Joker, for instance. They're really the same person. It's just how they kind of go through how they present themselves. And a lot of times the enemy, so to speak, which brings to mind the Jake Gyllenhaal film, Enemy. You're talking about the idea of the mirror self, something that's slightly off kilter. To go back to comics, you look at Bizarro Superman, like, the Bizarro world, this other world that is very similar to ours, but slightly off kilter. So now we're talking about parallel universes and things of that nature. We don't understand, like, the implications of what he was putting forth, but he uses the doppelganger as a technology to explore our inner demons, so to speak. And this is something I've been kind of thinking about my own writing. Like, if you look at someone like Lovecraft, like when he was writing, he was talking about these external cosmic forces, right, where I think a lot of times we're talking about these internal darknesses that live within inside mankind, and kind of inside man's psyche, which I think in us manifests itself as these twins. These people call them clones, but I've been trying to not call them clones. I'm like, I'm gonna go with what they call them. Instead of shadows, instead of the tethers, we don't understand the nature of their creation. Are we generating them into this other universe or what have you? Is this underworld like a different dimension? We have no idea. I think at the end result, the allegory is the most important thing, that he is talking about these struggles that we have. And, when you're creating the other is a part of us. The other is projected onto a subject, and we objectify the subject. That's the nature of othering. And then you give all these attributes to that particular other that you've created. Most of the time they're negative, that kind of thing. But you carry around that other with you. I was thinking about the German folktale around Peter Schlemiel. It's about this guy named Peter Schlemiel that sells his shadow to the devil. And so, people are creeped out by him because he doesn't cast a shadow. And so he ends up being ostracized and treated like he's evil because, what are you without your shadow? And that was what I was kind of talking about, this idea of Peter Pan and his shadow. He's trying to reacquire it so it gives him meaning, you know what I'm saying? And so when I talk about, like, untethering blackness from whiteness, for instance, right? What is whiteness without a shadow? Or what is man without woman? What is, being straight without, queerness? These types of things. These are poor and rich. These things are intimately connected. And that's why I think I like the term the tethering, because these ideas are polar opposites of each other, but also intertwined with each other.
Well, and I wonder if some people who don't like the film or aren't, like, really embracing it, if part of what Peele's kind of point is that we have to stop pointing the finger at something else and we have to start looking inside ourselves to find out what's wrong, that is a very difficult kind of thing for a lot of people to be willing to do, to look and say, like, okay, these problems don't come from outside; they're coming from...
They're internal.
Yeah,
exactly. No, it's very, and I think that is actually more scary than any monster that you can come up with. It's like dealing with what's in the mirror. Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think that's unsettling. That's what makes this a great horror movie. It's a very articulate kind of exploration of human nature. People were like, "Oh, this is trash," or "This is terrible." I was like, I wasn't even scared. I was like, well, then you should really sit with the film and think about what it's saying to you.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It was disturbing. I didn't, it was unsettling. And that's horror. That's what horror is, Horror is the affect of, you have dread, you have repulsion, which is kind of like the physical reaction to the thing that is terrible, which is a lot of times it's like people are retching and it's like, oh, what is that smell? That's the repulsion. That's the physical response. And then you have terror, which is like the fear of bodily harm, right? You're being terrified that, oh, I'm going to cut off your leg. Okay. The horror is what happens when the leg gets cut off.
Now, Jordan Peele did give his actors a list of 10 films to watch that he said he wanted them to see before they started working on the film. You have a film like A Tale of Two Sisters, which is this Korean horror film, but very clear. It's twins. It's this sense of mirror images and how,
It has a supernatural edge, too.
Right.
It has a supernatural underpinning, too. Yeah, that's a good movie, actually.
Now, another one that has some obvious connections is, as we've mentioned, It Follows, which shares the same cinematographer. It's beautifully shot, and your kind of discomfort comes from the contrast between kind of this surface beauty and this horror you're feeling.
Right, and the relentlessness of it. That's the other thing, too, is that, whatever it is, it's relentless. The other thing, too, is that it's not running after you. It's steady. So the dread is always at the end. That's what makes It Follow so great. You're like, wait, what is this? And you're the only person that sees it, too. So there's this mental, like, wait a minute, am I really experiencing this? That kind of thing. So It Follows is great. That's one of my favorite horror movies of the last decade or so.
Yeah, and I feel like it really is a kindred spirit to us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, because of the sense of dread and relentlessness. Like, you don't really understand the machinations of the tethered.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And they don't really, and they don't talk. You know what I'm saying? They're like, wait, what are you? Just like it doesn't talk. Whatever it is. And also, you don't know if they successfully kill it.
Right. It's not a happy ending. Another one he mentions is The Babadook. And this is a film.
Love The Babadook, man.
Which I love because being a film critic, I get to see films very early. And so all I knew about it was kind of that it was presented as a film kind of about the boogeyman. And it turns out to be something much deeper in that it's really about how do you deal with grief and loss. And so Us seems to have the same quality of seeming to be about a trope, which is, like these doppelgangers are coming after you and it's scary. And then it seems to have a much deeper meaning about something that stays with you kind of no matter what you do.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. That particular story is brilliant. And this is one of the films that I argue with my students about. I teach a class on like race and horror. Mm-hmm. I was telling about the Babadook and the notion of like how monsters are created. So the Babadook actually is a really great way to talk about grief and loss. And so the students are like, well, why is the monster still with them? And I was like, well, because you can't ever get rid of grief. It's a monster that actually is ever present. So that kind of thing.
Well, I know you have to get going. Is there any final words you want to say about the film?
I think that it bears a second viewing, especially because of the trick ending. And actually, too, he kind of tells you he's going to play a trick on you. I always think of the rabbit as a trickster, so he kind of shows that up front. And I think of the rabbit as this really interesting kind of symbol that trickery is happening. And these weird confluences of things that are happening, like the 11:11 on the clock, and the way that frisbee aligns itself. That makes me believe that something else outside of science is happening, that there's some kind of supernatural weirdness is happening. And I think that's the other thing, that people can't really wrap their heads around, like, what is the speculative thing that's happening? It's science and maybe the supernatural or something like that. So that's why I don't like the idea of calling them clones, even though they reference that idea. So I think that, this is a film that actually bears multiple viewings, maybe some research as far as how these particular things are kind of interacting off each other. But I like films like that. I love rewatching films. So I was like, I can't wait to see more things. So I want to go back and see it again with the knowledge that the two doppelgangers, because they're two doppelgangers, like what that also begs the question is which one is real? Like which one is the original? That's the other thing. So it's a very interesting shell game that he plays with us. Like, I think that he does a really interesting bait and switch where he says, okay, well, you have this world that I've built, but that actually isn't the thing that's important. What's really important is the relationship between Adelaide and Red, right?
Right.
So I think that's the thing. It's like people have to really kind of sit with what it means to actually deal with the demons inside of ourselves. And I think you did a great job of doing that. I want to see it again really, really soon.
I know. And it's interesting because that's the only pair that knows kind of what's going on to a certain degree, because the other doppelgangers seem to kill their twins very quickly, like in the house where the White family is. There's not a hesitation. But when Red comes in, there's almost this like, you need to face me and we need to kind of come to terms with a lot of things, whereas the other doppelgangers...
She wants to understand. Like there's this... There's a dialogue she wants to have with herself, you know what I'm saying? And to some degree, that is her undoing, because she wants to have this dialogue. I mean, really, she could have finished her at any given time. Like that ballet martial arts thing that they were doing in the hallway was great.
All right. Well, I'm sorry you have to go, but thank you so much for talking with me about Us.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. No, this was my pleasure.
That was UC Riverside professor John Jennings. He was recently on the podcast talking about his collective called Scary Black Folks. I urge you to check out that episode to hear more of his ideas about Black horror. Thanks for listening to another episode of Cinema Junkie Podcast. Till our next Film Fix, I'm Beth Accomando, your resident cinema junkie.
KPBS On Demand is supported by Splatero, helping homeowners pay off debt by offering streamlined access to your home's equity with no additional monthly payments or new debt. Splatero provides a lump sum of payment in exchange for a share of your home's future value. Pre-qualification is available at splatero.com.